By the spring of 1775, the colony of Massachusetts was a land holding its breath, a place where years of frustration had hardened into a steely resolve. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, a palpable energy born from simmering resentment against the British crown. For over a decade, colonists had protested against taxes imposed by a distant parliament where they had no voice, no representation. Acts like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts were seen not just as economic burdens, but as profound insults to their rights as Englishmen. This was a conflict of ideas long before it became a conflict of arms, a deep-seated belief that they were being governed without their consent. The British government, viewing this colonial defiance as outright insolence, decided to make an example of Massachusetts. The port of Boston was closed, its colonial charter was revoked, and thousands of British soldiers, the famous Redcoats, were stationed in the city to enforce royal authority. Parliament officially declared the colony to be in a state of open rebellion. This was no longer a disagreement, it was a showdown. The man caught in the middle of this escalating crisis was General Thomas Gage, the royal governor of Massachusetts and the commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America, a man tasked with quenching a fire that was rapidly spreading beyond his control. From his headquarters in the heart of Boston, General Gage was under immense pressure from London. His orders were clear and uncompromising: disarm the rebels and arrest their most prominent leaders. He was to act decisively and put a swift end to the colonial defiance before it could inspire other colonies to follow suit. Gage's spies had provided him with what seemed like the perfect target. They confirmed that the quiet farming town of Concord, located about 20 miles inland, was being used as a major depot for the growing colonial militia, a place where cannons, muskets, gunpowder, and other military supplies were being stockpiled in alarming quantities. Gage formulated a plan that on paper appeared both logical and efficient. He would dispatch a strong column of his best troops on a secret night march. They would move quickly, seize the weapons cache in Concord before the colonists could react, and return to Boston, demonstrating the overwhelming power and reach of the British military. He believed this single surgical strike would shatter the morale of the rebellion, scattering its supporters and restoring royal authority without the need for a wider conflict. It was a classic military solution to a political problem, but Gage profoundly underestimated the people he was tasked with subjugating. He was about to provide the very spark that would ignite the entire continent. For 700 professional soldiers of the British Army, the 16-mile road from Concord back to Boston was meant to be a simple march, a routine return to garrison after a successful mission. These men were the elite of a global superpower, the disciplined and feared Redcoats who had secured an empire that spanned the globe. They were the grenadiers and light infantry, the pride of the King's army, accustomed to victory and contemptuous of the amateur colonial militias. The mission was straightforward: march to Concord, confiscate the illegal weapons, and march back. It was intended as a show of force, a powerful reminder of who was in charge in Massachusetts. However, what was planned as a demonstration of authority was destined to become something else entirely. That 16-mile stretch of country road would transform into a 16-mile-long gauntlet of terror and death. The journey back to the safety of Boston would become a desperate, bloody, and chaotic running battle for survival. The hunters would become the hunted, pursued relentlessly by an enemy that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. The disciplined lines of scarlet-coated infantry would be torn apart by an invisible foe, their confidence and cohesion shattered by a form of warfare they were utterly unprepared to face. This is the incredible story of how a seemingly mismatched collection of colonial citizens, farmers, blacksmiths, mechanics, and merchants, managed to challenge the might of the British Empire. These were the Minutemen, a citizen militia so named because they pledged to be ready to fight at a minute's notice. They were not professional soldiers, but they were fighting on their own land, for their own homes, and for their own vision of liberty. They possessed an intimate knowledge of the landscape that their opponents could never hope to match, and they were about to use that knowledge with lethal effectiveness. The fields, forests, and stone walls of the Massachusetts countryside would become their greatest allies. They transformed the familiar terrain into a weapon, turning every hill into a sniper's perch and every bend in the road into a potential kill zone. The story of this bloody road is the story of how a retreat was turned into a rout, how a disciplined army was brought to the brink of annihilation, and how a localized protest erupted into a full-blown revolution. It was the day that ordinary colonists proved that their determination, their knowledge of the land, and their righteous anger could stand against one of the most powerful military forces on the planet. The conflict that erupted on April 19, 1775, was not a battle in the traditional European sense. There were no grand cavalry charges or neatly arrayed armies facing each other across an open field. Instead, it was a fluid, chaotic, and brutal series of ambushes and skirmishes that unfolded over miles of road. The British soldiers found themselves fighting not a single army, but the entire countryside. For every militiaman they saw, there were 10 more hidden behind a stone wall, crouched in a ditch, or firing from the window of a farmhouse. It was a terrifying new kind of war, one that blurred the line between civilian and soldier. The colonists were driven by a powerful mix of fear, anger, and a desperate will to defend their communities. The news of the morning's events at Lexington, where British troops had fired on their neighbors, spread through the towns like wildfire, fueling a collective rage. Men grabbed their muskets not as rebels seeking to overthrow a king, but as homeowners defending their property and families from what they saw as an invading army. They raced toward the sound of the guns, their numbers swelling with every passing hour, forming a vast, spontaneous, and leaderless army united by a common purpose. As the British column began its long and arduous retreat from Concord, they were systematically hunted. The colonists used guerrilla tactics, firing from concealed positions and then melting away into the woods, only to reappear further down the road to strike again. They knew every shortcut, every ravine, and every thicket that offered cover. For the Redcoats marching in tight formation on the exposed road, it was a nightmare. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once, their attacks coming from all sides without warning, turning the orderly column into a string of isolated and vulnerable targets. This desperate running battle would ultimately ignite a revolution that would change the course of world history. The blood spilled on the road between Concord and Boston washed away any remaining hope for a peaceful reconciliation. It demonstrated to the American colonists that they could, in fact, stand up to the professional soldiers of the British Empire, and it sent a shocking message back to London that the rebellion in Massachusetts was not a small-scale insurrection to be easily crushed, but a deep and powerful movement willing to pay the ultimate price for its freedom. The Bloody Road was the beginning of the end of British rule in America. From his headquarters in Boston, General Thomas Gage was a man walking a tightrope, caught between the demands of his political masters in London and the volatile reality on the ground in Massachusetts. He received secret orders that were direct and left little room for interpretation. He was to disarm the colonial rebels and arrest their most influential leaders, specifically mentioning Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The goal was to decapitate the burgeoning revolutionary movement before it could gain any more momentum. Gage knew that any action he took carried immense risk. A move that was too aggressive could provoke a violent uprising, yet inaction would be seen as weakness by both his superiors and the defiant colonists. His intelligence network, comprised of loyalist spies, zeroed in on the town of Concord as the key to crippling the rebellion. Reports confirmed that Concord was not just a sleepy village, but a critical logistics hub for the Patriot cause, a place where a vast arsenal was being gathered. Cannons, mortars, muskets, barrels of gunpowder, and thousands of musket balls were being stored in barns, cellars, and public buildings throughout the town. For Gage, seizing this cache of weapons seemed like the perfect solution. It would deny the militia the very means to fight and serve as a powerful public display of British military superiority, all accomplished with a single decisive operation. The plan he devised was a classic military gambit, relying on speed, secrecy, and overwhelming force to achieve its objectives before the enemy could mount an effective response. Gage intended to dispatch a column of his finest troops, the Grenadiers and Light Infantry companies, on a swift, silent night march. They would slip out of Boston under the cover of darkness, cross the Charles River, and march the 20 miles to Concord. Once there, they would quickly secure the town, locate and destroy all the military supplies, and then march back to Boston, hopefully before the sun was high in the sky. On paper, the plan was solid, a textbook example of a preemptive strike designed to neutralize a threat with minimal bloodshed. Gage believed that by striking at the heart of the colonists' military preparations, he could break their will to resist. He envisioned a mission that would be over in a matter of hours, restoring order and reasserting the Crown's authority without sparking a full-scale war. It was a calculated risk, but one he felt compelled to take. He was gambling that the colonists, when faced with the disciplined might of British regulars, would simply back down. It was a gamble he was about to lose spectacularly. On the cold, clear evening of April 18, 1775, General Gage's plan was set into motion. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, a force of roughly 700 British soldiers was quietly assembled on Boston Common. These were not ordinary troops. They were the elite flank companies drawn from the various regiments stationed in the city. The towering grenadiers, known for their strength and shock value, and the agile light infantry, skilled in skirmishing and rapid movement, represented the very best of the British Army in North America. Their mission was of the utmost secrecy, with many of the soldiers themselves unaware of their final destination. Their operation began with a stealthy crossing of the Charles River. Longboats, requisitioned from the Royal Navy warships, ferried the troops from the bottom of the Common to the Lechmere Point marshes on the opposite shore. The process was slow and fraught with difficulty. The soldiers, burdened with heavy packs, ammunition, and their muskets, had to wade through the cold, waist-deep water of the tidal flats to reach dry land. The secrecy and darkness added to the confusion, and vital time was lost before the column could be properly formed and begin its long march west into the hostile countryside. However, in a city seething with revolutionary fervor, a city that was effectively an occupied territory, true secrecy was an impossible luxury. Boston was a web of patriot spies and informants, and the Sons of Liberty, led by figures like Dr. Joseph Warren, had been watching every British move for weeks. They had anticipated an action of this kind and had prepared accordingly. The unusual activity did not go unnoticed. The Patriots' intelligence network sprang to life, confirming their worst fears. The regulars were finally making their move against the countryside. Before the first British soldier had even set foot on the road to Concord, the Patriot alarm system was already being activated. Dr. Warren knew he had to act fast. He summoned 2 trusted couriers, a silversmith named Paul Revere and a tanner named William Dawes. He gave them the critical task of riding ahead of the British column to warn the militia and alert Hancock and Adams, who were staying in Lexington directly in the path of the advancing Redcoats. The secret mission was no longer a secret. The fundamental flaw in General Gage's plan was not in its military logic, but in its profound misunderstanding of the people he had been sent to govern. Gage, along with many in the British command and political establishment, viewed the American colonists through a lens of aristocratic condescension. They saw them as a disorganized rabble of farmers and merchants, undisciplined, lacking in courage, and certainly no match for professional soldiers. They believed that a firm show of force, a display of scarlet coats and gleaming bayonets, would be enough to intimidate the colonists into submission. This was a catastrophic failure of imagination and intelligence. They failed to appreciate the depth of the colonists' ideological commitment. For the people of Massachusetts, this was not just a dispute over taxes, it was a struggle for their fundamental rights and their way of life. They were educated, well-read in the principles of liberty and self-governance, and they saw the actions of the British government as a direct assault on their heritage as free Englishmen. This powerful conviction had forged a unity and a resolve that the British leadership simply could not comprehend. They were not dealing with a mob, they were dealing with a people who had already mentally declared their independence. Furthermore, the British completely underestimated the colonists' military preparedness. While the militia may have lacked the spit-and-polish discipline of the regulars, they were far from an untrained mob. Many were veterans of the French and Indian War, experienced in the harsh realities of North American combat. They were proficient with their muskets, which they used for hunting as well as defense, and they were organized into local companies that drilled regularly. The creation of the Minuteman companies represented a heightened state of readiness, a clear signal that they were prepared not just to protest, but to fight for their cause. In dispatching his troops to Concord, General Gage believed he was taking a decisive step to prevent a war. In reality, he was providing the very spark that would ignite the powder keg of colonial anger. His surgical strike was not going to be the end of the rebellion. It was going to be its beginning. The march of the 700 Redcoats into the countryside was not seen by the colonists as a police action, but as an invasion. It was an act of aggression that would galvanize thousands of ordinary men to leave their homes and farms, pick up their guns, and converge on the road from Concord, ready to make a stand. As Lieutenant Colonel Smith's force struggled to organize itself in the dark marshes across the Charles River, Boston's Patriot network was already executing a plan of remarkable sophistication. Dr. Joseph Warren, the central nervous system of the rebellion, had not put all his faith in a single rider. He knew that the British would likely have patrols out, seeking to intercept any messengers. To ensure the alarm reached the countryside, he had devised a beautifully simple yet effective visual signal. This backup plan was designed to communicate the most crucial piece of intelligence: the route the British Army was taking out of the city, a detail that would determine how the colonial militia should respond. The plan centered on the tallest structure in Boston, the steeple of the Old North Church. From its high vantage point, signals could be seen across the river in Charlestown, where other patriots were waiting. The sexton of the church, a man named Robert Newman, was tasked with the dangerous job of climbing the dark, creaking stairs to the belfry. He carried with him 2 lanterns. The code had been pre-arranged with militia leaders outside the city: 1 lantern if the British were marching out by land over the narrow Boston Neck, and 2 lanterns if they were crossing the Charles River by boat to take the more direct sea route. Moments after the British troops began their embarkation, Newman slipped into the church and made his ascent. High above the sleeping city, he hung 2 lanterns in the steeple window, their light shining out across the dark water towards Charlestown. The twin flames were a silent, ghostly message, a beacon of defiance cutting through the night. For the waiting patriots across the river, it was the confirmation they needed. The British were coming by sea. The warning system, a brilliant piece of covert communication, had worked perfectly. It was a testament to the organization and dedication of the Sons of Liberty. This simple act of hanging 2 lanterns was an act of high treason, a clear and deliberate defiance of royal authority that could have seen Newman arrested and hanged. Yet, it was this quiet courage, repeated by countless individuals throughout the night, that defined the spirit of the rebellion. The signal ensured that even if the riders, Paul Revere and William Dawes, were captured, the alarm would still be raised. It was a crucial first step in a chain reaction that would soon awaken the entire Massachusetts countryside, turning a secret military operation into a public spectacle and a race against time. With the signal flashing in the night sky, Dr. Joseph Warren dispatched his 2 primary riders on their critical missions. He sent William Dawes, a tanner and fellow member of the Sons of Liberty, on a longer, less direct route out of Boston by way of the land bridge at Boston Neck. Dawes, a skilled actor, was known for his ability to mimic the accents and mannerisms of a drunken farmer, a disguise he used to slip past the British sentries guarding the city's only land exit. His journey was slower, but served as a vital, secondary line of communication, ensuring the alarm spread through the towns to the south and west of the British route. The more famous of the 2 riders was the silversmith Paul Revere. His route was more direct, but also more perilous. He had to be rowed quietly across the Charles River, right under the menacing guns of the HMS Somerset, a massive British warship anchored in the harbor to monitor all traffic. Slipping past the naval patrol in a small boat, Revere landed in Charlestown, where patriots were waiting with a horse. He confirmed that he had seen the 2 lantern signal, mounted his steed, and began his legendary gallop towards Lexington, his mind focused on the urgent task of warning Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Revere's ride was not a solitary, silent journey. As he thundered through the sleeping towns of Medford, Menotomy, and Arlington, he did not shout the now famous but inaccurate phrase, "The British are coming." To do so would have made little sense, as most colonists still considered themselves British. Instead, his urgent and repeated cry was, "The regulars are out! The regulars are out!" This was a specific and terrifying warning, instantly understood by the local militia leaders and townspeople. It meant the king's professional soldiers, the Redcoats, were on the march, and their purpose could only be hostile. Along the way, Revere methodically alerted key patriot leaders, knocking on doors and delivering his message with grim efficiency. His ride was a masterclass in organized alarm. He was not just a messenger, but a mobile command center, ensuring that the local militia captains knew to muster their men. Near Lexington, Revere was joined by William Dawes, who had arrived via his own route. Together they rode on toward Concord, their warnings now spreading exponentially. They were later joined by a 3rd rider, a young doctor named Samuel Prescott, who would prove essential in carrying the alarm the final, crucial miles to its destination. The cries of the riders were the sparks that landed on the perfectly laid tinder of colonial readiness. All through the night, as Revere, Dawes, and Prescott galloped from town to town, their urgent warnings echoed across the dark landscape. The message was passed from one farm to the next, from one village to another, creating a cascading wave of alarm. In response to the news that the regulars were out, a prearranged system of signals sprang to life. The deep, resonant tolling of church bells began to peal through the night air, a sound that carried for miles and spoke of immediate danger. In other areas, the signal was more visceral. Heavy signal guns, small cannons kept for this very purpose, were fired into the darkness, their booming reports serving as an unmistakable call to arms. Bonfires were lit on prominent hilltops, their flames visible from distant towns, relaying the message faster than any horse could travel. This symphony of alarms, shouts, bells, guns, and fires shattered the peace of the Massachusetts night. It was the sound of a population mobilizing for war, a citizen army rising from its sleep to defend its homes and its rights. The effect was immediate and dramatic. In homes across the countryside, men heard the call and reached for the muskets that hung over their fireplaces. They were the Minutemen, so named for their promise to be ready to fight at a minute's notice. They were farmers, blacksmiths, coopers, and merchants. They said brief, tense goodbyes to their families, grabbed their powder horns and bullet pouches, and melted into the darkness, heading for their designated town commons or meeting houses. This was the moment they had been training for, the moment when their political convictions demanded physical courage. By the time the British column under Lieutenant Colonel Smith had marched only a few miles, their mission secrecy was completely blown. The element of surprise, so crucial to their plan, had been lost. Instead of marching into a sleeping and unsuspecting countryside, they were now marching into a landscape that was wide awake, armed, and waiting for them. The midnight ride had done more than just warn a few key leaders. It had activated an entire defensive network. The secret march on Concord was no longer a secret, and the colonists were preparing to make a stand. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to streak the eastern sky on the morning of April 19, 1775, the British advance guard marched into the small, unassuming town of Lexington. This forward element, consisting of about 240 light infantrymen, was commanded by the hot-tempered Marine Major, John Pitcairn. They moved with the confident swagger of professional soldiers, their scarlet coats a stark and imposing sight against the quiet backdrop of the village. Their march had been long and tiring, but they were now nearing their first objective, expecting little more than to secure the road for the main force following behind them. What they found instead was a silent, armed challenge waiting for them on the town green. Drawn up in two ragged lines on the common was a small company of about 77 local militiamen. These were not soldiers by trade, they were the farmers, artisans, and neighbors of Lexington, men who had answered the alarm in the middle of the night. Their commander was Captain John Parker, a 45-year-old farmer who was sick with tuberculosis but was a hardened veteran of the French and Indian War. He knew his small, outnumbered force was no match for the disciplined British regulars. His intention was not to provoke a battle but to make a clear, unambiguous political statement, a symbolic show of armed protest on their own training ground. As the British column halted, their officers taking in the scene, the air grew thick with tension. The sheer disparity in numbers and training was immense. On one side stood the elite light infantry of a global empire, perfectly drilled and equipped for war. On the other stood a gathering of citizens, armed with a variety of personal firearms, standing in defense of their community and their rights. Captain Parker, understanding the gravity of the situation and the near certainty of being overwhelmed, reportedly gave his men a command that would echo through history. "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Major Pitcairn, along with other British officers, rode forward, incensed by the sight of armed colonists blocking their path. They viewed it as an act of open, treasonous rebellion. With swords drawn, they began shouting commands at the militiamen, their voices sharp with authority and anger. They ordered the colonists to lay down their arms and disperse immediately, calling them rebels and traitors. The verbal confrontation escalated quickly, the shouts of the British officers creating a chaotic and confusing scene. Parker, seeing that his protest had been made and that resistance was futile, gave the order for his men to fall back and disperse, but not to lay down their weapons. In the tense and chaotic moments that followed Captain Parker's order to disperse, the Lexington militia began to slowly break apart. The men did not run, they turned and began to walk away, still carrying their muskets, a final small act of defiance. The British officers continued to shout, their commands overlapping and adding to the confusion. The Redcoats, on edge after their long night march and primed for a confrontation, watched the colonists with nervous anticipation. It was a fragile, volatile moment, a single spark away from exploding into violence. The fate of the British Empire and its American colonies hung precariously in the balance on this small patch of grass. Then, from the hazy morning air, a single gunshot rang out. To this day, no one knows for certain who fired that first, fateful shot. It could have come from a nervous militiaman firing without orders, or from a jittery British soldier whose finger slipped on the trigger. Some accounts suggest it may have come from a colonial spectator watching from behind a nearby stone wall or tavern. The origin of that shot is forever lost to history, a mystery that has been debated for over 2 centuries. But in that instant, the identity of the shooter became irrelevant. That one anonymous report was the spark that ignited the American Revolution. The sound of the shot shattered the tense standoff. The British soldiers, perhaps believing their officers had given an order to fire or that they were under attack from the dispersing militia, did what they were trained to do. Without waiting for a clear command from Major Pitcairn, who was reportedly still trying to control his men, the front ranks of the light infantry leveled their muskets and unleashed a devastating, rolling volley directly into the backs of the retreating colonists. The disciplined crash of dozens of muskets firing at once tore through the morning air, a sound of shocking and irreversible violence that sealed the day's tragic course. The initial volley was followed by a brutal bayonet charge. The Redcoats, their discipline momentarily lost in the heat of the moment, surged forward onto the green, cheering as they ran. They fell upon the few remaining or wounded militiamen with cold steel. The colonists, caught completely by surprise by the ferocity of the attack, had no chance to mount any kind of organized defense. The brief, one-sided confrontation was over in a matter of minutes. The silent protest had turned into a bloody rout, and the green was now a scene of carnage, forever changing the nature of the conflict between Britain and its American colonies. When the thick, acrid smoke from the black powder finally began to clear from Lexington Green, the terrible cost of those few chaotic moments was laid bare. The pristine grass of the town common was stained dark with blood. 8 American colonists lay dead or dying, including Captain Parker's own cousin, Jonas Parker, who was bayoneted after being wounded by the first volley. 10 other militiamen were wounded, some severely. The Lexington Company had been shattered and humiliated. The British, on the other hand, had suffered only a single soldier lightly wounded. The military action had been a swift and overwhelming success for the King's troops. In the immediate aftermath, the British soldiers let out a triumphant cheer, a traditional sign of victory on the battlefield. They fired a victory volley into the air and gave 3 huzzas to celebrate their easy dispersal of the colonial rebels. Their officers, having regained control of their men, quickly reformed the column. There was no time to linger. Their primary mission, the seizure of the military stores in Concord, still lay ahead. Leaving the dead and wounded colonists where they lay, the British light infantry resumed their march, their confidence bolstered by the morning's events. They believed they had taught the provincials a harsh lesson, but they had done something far more significant than scatter a local militia. They had shed the first blood of a new war, fundamentally and irrevocably changing the conflict from a political dispute into a military one. The news of what happened on Lexington Green, quickly dubbed the Lexington Massacre by Patriot propagandists, spread like wildfire throughout the surrounding countryside. The story, often embellished, of British regulars firing on and bayoneting their fellow subjects, created a wave of shock, horror, and incandescent rage. This was no longer about taxes or representation. It was now about defending their homes and avenging their dead countrymen. The British soldiers marched on to Concord, convinced they had crushed the rebellion's spirit. In reality, they had ignited it. The blood spilled at Lexington served as a powerful and visceral call to arms, far more effective than any pamphlet or speech. It transformed hesitant farmers into determined fighters. As the Redcoats continued their march, they were oblivious to the fact that the very ground they were treading was turning against them. Ahead of them lay Concord, but all around them, from every farm and village, hundreds and soon thousands of armed colonists were now swarming toward the road, their hearts filled with a burning desire for revenge. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, the main British column under Lieutenant Colonel Smith finally marched into the town of Concord. They arrived to find the town strangely quiet, almost deserted. After the brief, violent clash at Lexington, They expected to meet more resistance, but the town green was empty. The colonists had withdrawn, choosing not to confront the full might of the 700-man British force in an open field. Smith, feeling confident after the easy dispersal of the Lexington militia, immediately set his men to their primary task, locating and destroying the vast cache of military supplies that their intelligence had reported was hidden throughout the town. It was the entire reason for this long and arduous march. The British troops split up into smaller companies, fanning out across Concord to conduct a thorough search. Grenadiers stood guard over the town's two bridges, the North Bridge and the South Bridge, to secure their lines of retreat and prevent militia from entering the town. Other companies began a methodical house-by-house search. They tossed hay in barns, probed gardens with their bayonets, and entered private homes and public buildings, looking for the telltale signs of hidden munitions. The soldiers were professional and for the most part restrained in their search, with officers paying for any food or drink they consumed. But for the townspeople watching, it was still a profound violation, an army of occupation ransacking their homes. However, the Redcoats' search yielded frustratingly little. Thanks to the timely and effective warnings delivered by the Patriot riders, the people of Concord had been working frantically for hours to hide their arsenal. Dr. Samuel Prescott, who had evaded the British patrol that captured Revere, had successfully reached the town, giving them precious time. Carts had been loaded and sent to neighboring towns, barrels of flour and salted meat were concealed, and most importantly, the heavy brass cannons had been cleverly plowed into a field as if they were freshly turned furrows. The colonists had outsmarted them, turning the landscape itself into a hiding place. The British soldiers did find some success, but it was minor compared to what they had expected to uncover. They located and destroyed a few gun carriages which they hacked apart and set ablaze. They discovered several large barrels of flour and salted provisions, which they broke open and spoiled. They also found a quantity of musket balls and cartridges which they dutifully threw into the town mill pond. But the main prize, the cannons and the bulk of the gunpowder, remained elusive. The surgical strike was proving to be far from precise, and the mission's primary objective was slipping through their fingers with every passing minute of their fruitless search. While Lieutenant Colonel Smith's men were busy searching Concord, the strategic situation outside the town was changing rapidly and, well, dangerously. On Punkatasset Hill, a high point overlooking the North Bridge and the town beyond, the colonial militia was gathering. What had started as a small group of Concord men had swelled into a formidable force. Companies of Minutemen and militia from the surrounding towns of Acton, Bedford, Lincoln, and Carlisle had heard the alarms and were marching to the sound of the guns. By mid-morning, their numbers had grown to over 400 men, and more were arriving constantly. They were no longer a small band of protesters, they were becoming an army. From their vantage point, the assembled colonists could see everything the British were doing. They watched as the Redcoats occupied their town and held the bridge. They could see the small company of about 100 light infantrymen from the 4th, 10th, and 43rd regiments guarding the North Bridge, a thin line of scarlet separating them from their homes. The mood among the militia was tense and uncertain. They were anxious, angry, but also hesitant. They were citizen soldiers, and the decision to fire on the King's troops was a momentous one, a step from which there would be no turning back. They debated their options, with some urging caution and others demanding immediate action. Then, a sight from the center of town galvanized the colonists and pushed them from anxious waiting to grim determination. They saw smoke beginning to rise from Concord. Unbeknownst to them, the smoke was from the burning gun carriages that the British had found and set alight, a fire that was quickly extinguished. But from their distant viewpoint, the conclusion was terrifying and immediate. The Redcoats were burning their homes, their town was being put to the torch. This fear, this visceral image of destruction, swept through the militia ranks, crystallizing their resolve. The time for deliberation was over, the time for action was now. A quiet but firm consensus was reached. They would march down from the hill and retake the bridge to defend their town. Colonel James Barrett, the senior militia commander, gave the order to advance. The Acton Militia Company, known for its high morale and led by a popular 30-year-old gunsmith named Captain Isaac Davis, volunteered to take the lead. Davis, when asked if he and his men were afraid to confront the regulars, famously and resolutely replied, I haven't a man that is afraid to go." With their fife and drum playing the defiant tune, the White Cockade, the 400 colonial militiamen began their organized, deliberate march down the hill, directly towards the waiting British soldiers. The British soldiers guarding the North Bridge watched in disbelief as the colonial force descended the hill. They were stunned by the sight of hundreds of provincials marching towards them in an organized column, not as a chaotic mob but as a disciplined military body. The British officers, outnumbered 4-1, grew increasingly nervous. They hastily tried to pull their men back across the bridge to establish a stronger defensive position on the conquered side of the river. As the colonists continued their steady advance, the Redcoats fired a few scattered warning shots, hoping to deter them. The bullets splashed harmlessly into the river, but they were the first shots fired by British troops in Concord. The warning shots failed to break the colonists' resolve. They continued their march, closing the distance to the bridge. The British soldiers, now in a state of near panic, unleashed a ragged but deadly volley. This time their aim was true. The volley struck the head of the colonial column with brutal force. Captain Isaac Davis of Acton, leading from the front, was shot through the heart and killed instantly. Abner Hosmer, a private from the same company marching beside him, was also killed. The lead ranks were staggered by the impact. For a moment it seemed as though the militia might break and run, just as they had at Lexington earlier that morning. But this time, the colonists did not run. Their shock and grief turned instantly to fury. The sight of their captain and their neighbor lying dead on the ground erased any final hesitation. The American commander on the scene, Major John Buttrick of Concord, leaped into the air and yelled the order that would change the world. "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" From a distance of only 50 yards, the front ranks of the colonial militia leveled their muskets over the heads of their comrades and returned fire. Their volley, a ragged but concentrated blast of lead, tore into the tight formation of the British regulars standing exposed at the other end of the bridge. The effect of the American volley was devastating. The British light infantry, packed together in a confined space, made for easy targets. 3 private soldiers were killed outright, and 9 more, including 4 of the 8 officers present, were wounded. Outnumbered, shocked by the colonists' willingness to stand and fight, and staggered by their losses, the British soldiers did something unimaginable. They broke and fled. They abandoned their wounded and ran in a panicked, disorganized rout back towards the main body of troops in Concord. For the first time that day, British regulars had been fired upon and forced to retreat by colonial militiamen. The shot heard round the world had been answered. The sharp, bloody exchange at the North Bridge was a profound shock to the British command. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, who had remained in the center of Concord, now faced a rapidly deteriorating situation. His mission to seize the colonial arsenal had been a near-total failure, yielding only a few minor successes. More alarmingly, the brief but violent fight at the bridge demonstrated that the provincial militia was not only willing to stand and fight back, but that they could inflict serious casualties on his professional soldiers. The entire countryside was now alerted, and he could hear the distant ringing of church bells and the pop of signal guns, signaling that more and more colonial fighters were converging on his position. Smith gathered his officers for a tense council of war amidst the growing chaos. He had to weigh his options carefully. His men were already tired from the long night march and the morning's exertions. Their limited ammunition had been partially expended, and they were now deep in what was clearly hostile territory, miles from the safety of Boston. To remain in Concord any longer was to risk being completely surrounded and cut off by the ever-growing numbers of colonial militia. The initial confidence of the morning had evaporated, replaced by a grim sense of foreboding. The mission was a failure, and now the priority had to shift from seizing weapons to saving his command. The decision was inevitable. Around noon, Lieutenant Colonel Smith gave the order he had hoped to avoid: retreat to Boston. The 700 British soldiers, still proud but now deeply uneasy, began to form their long column for the 16-mile march home. They moved with professional discipline, placing their elite light infantry companies as a protective flank screen, marching parallel to the main road to guard against ambushes from the sides. But this was nothing like the relatively peaceful march out from Boston hours earlier. The atmosphere was now thick with menace, the quiet fields and woods no longer seeming tranquil but instead hiding an unseen and gathering threat. The colonists who had fought at the North Bridge did not pursue the British into the town's center. Instead, they crossed the bridge, gathered their fallen comrades, and then shadowed the British column from a safe distance, their numbers continuing to swell. They were waiting for the right moment, the right ground, to strike. For the British soldiers, the march began with a sense of weary resolve, but they could feel the eyes of the countryside upon them. For the thousands of militiamen now swarming towards the road, this was their chance. The orderly retreat was about to transform into a desperate 16-mile running battle for survival. The bloody road had begun. The first major, coordinated attack on the retreating British column occurred at a seemingly insignificant junction known as Meriam's Corner. Here, the road narrowed to cross a small stream over a bridge, forcing Lieutenant Colonel Smith to pull in his protective flank guards and compress his entire formation. This maneuver left the main body of his troops dangerously exposed. It was the moment the colonists had been waiting for. As the British soldiers funneled into this natural bottleneck, the trap was sprung. The carefully planned withdrawal was about to descend into a desperate running fight for their lives, a brutal gauntlet of fire and death. From behind the Meriam family house, from behind sturdy stone walls, and from the cover of nearby orchards, hundreds of militiamen opened fire. These were not the conquered men who had fought at the bridge, but fresh companies who had just arrived on the scene. Men from Reading, Chelmsford, and Billerica had marched for hours to get here, and they arrived just in time to catch the British column at its most vulnerable. There was no hesitation, no warning shots. This was a deliberate, calculated ambush. The crackle of musketry erupted from all sides, signaling a dramatic and deadly shift in the day's events. The rules of engagement had changed from protest to outright warfare. The British flanking parties scrambled to re-engage the attackers, but they were caught off guard and outnumbered. The colonial fire was intense and surprisingly accurate, sending the Redcoats reeling. The disciplined British lines became a liability. The soldiers were bunched together, making them perfect targets for the militiamen firing from concealed positions. The initial volley caused confusion and casualties, staggering the long column and sowing the seeds of panic. From Meriam's Corner onward, the retreat became a continuous, rolling nightmare for the Redcoats. The colonists, their numbers now swelling into the thousands, shadowed the British column relentlessly. They would fire from cover, melt back into the woods and fields they knew so intimately, and then race ahead to set up the next ambush. A British ensign later wrote in his diary that the hills on each side of us were covered with rebels. The colonists' greatest weapon wasn't their muskets. It was the land itself. Farmers and artisans, intimately familiar with every stone wall and wooded bend, turned their home terrain into a deadly maze for the British. Stone walls became barricades, woods offered perfect cover, and every hill was a sniper's perch. The British, trained for open field battles, were thrown into chaos by invisible enemies striking from all sides. The colonists fought as independent militias, ambushing, firing, and melting away, never giving the Redcoats a chance to regroup. For 16 miles, the British were relentlessly hunted, the land itself rising against them. At a sharp bend called the Bloody Angle, the colonists set their deadliest ambush. Hundreds of militiamen, hidden on both sides, unleashed a devastating crossfire as the British entered the trap. The Redcoats, packed tightly on the narrow road, became easy targets. Panic and confusion reigned. Officers' commands were drowned out by musket fire and screams. Discipline collapsed. The British suffered heavy losses, their retreat devolving into a desperate scramble for survival. The Bloody Angle marked the moment the British realized they were fighting for their lives, not just their pride. The Lexington militia, led by Captain John Parker, sought vengeance for their earlier defeat. Bloodied but unbroken, they ambushed the retreating British from a rocky hillside. Parker's revenge. Their close-range volley shattered the British ranks and wounded their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Smith. The attack was swift and punishing, a symbol of colonial resilience and resolve. The message was clear: the colonists would not be cowed. They would fight back, harder each time. Parker's revenge echoed the spirit of the entire day defeat transformed into determined resistance. By afternoon, the British column was falling apart, exhausted, low on ammunition, and leaderless. The retreat became a rout, with soldiers abandoning formation and running for their lives. The colonists pressed closer, turning the road into a gauntlet of death. The British, once contemptuous of the militia, now faced terror and humiliation. Only the hope of reinforcements kept them from total destruction. The mighty British army was bleeding out, saved from annihilation only by what lay ahead. Salvation arrived as General Percy's fresh brigade and cannons formed a defensive square on Lexington Green. The battered survivors collapsed in relief, shielded at last from the relentless colonial assault. Percy's artillery forced the militia to fall back, buying the British a brief, crucial respite. But Percy saw the grim reality. His force was deep in hostile territory, with many men already lost. He knew he couldn't stay. Retreat to Boston was the only option. After a short rest, the reinforced column prepared for the final bloody push home. As the British retreated through Menotomy, the fighting reached new levels of brutality. Militia numbers swelled, and the battle spilled into homes. Bayonets and musket butts in kitchens and parlors. The Jason Russell House became a scene of massacre. The line between soldier and civilian vanished. For 2 miles, Menotomy was a running savage firefight, deadlier than Lexington or Concord. Percy's cannons were useless in the close quarters. The British suffered heavy losses. The colonists' relentless attacks turned the final miles into the bloodiest phase of the day. As the British column finally cleared the bloody chaos of Menotomy, they were in a desperate race against time and daylight. The soldiers were nearing the limits of human endurance, and the colonial attacks, though perhaps less coordinated, remained relentless. The militia continued to shadow the column, firing from every hill, orchard and building along the route through Cambridge and Somerville. Brigadier General Percy, realizing his force was still in grave danger, made a crucial command decision. Instead of trying to retreat back into Boston via the narrow land bridge at Boston Neck, he would veer towards the Charlestown Peninsula. This decision was strategically sound. Charlestown was situated directly across the river from Boston's north end, and its hills were under the protective cover of the Royal Navy's powerful warships anchored in the harbor. The massive cannons of HMS Somerset and other vessels could provide the covering fire that his own field pieces could no longer sustain. The race to Charlestown became the final, frantic objective. The Redcoats, exhausted, bloodied and battered, made a final push towards the safety offered by the fleet's guns, with the American militia snapping at their heels every step of the way, determined to inflict as much damage as possible before their prey escaped. As the sun began to set, the leading elements of Percy's column finally staggered onto the high ground of Bunker Hill in Charlestown. The big guns of the Royal Navy opened fire, sending cannonballs screaming over the heads of the retreating soldiers towards the pursuing colonists. The naval bombardment finally did what the 1,700 British soldiers could not. It forced the American militia to halt their attack. The colonists, having no artillery to counter the warships, reluctantly broke off their pursuit at the base of the peninsula, their quarry having finally reached sanctuary. The 16-mile-long running battle was finally over. The exhausted British soldiers collapsed onto the ground, many too tired to even stand. They were finally safe from the swarms of militia, but their sanctuary was effectively an island prison. They had made it back, but they had been thoroughly beaten and utterly humiliated. The finest soldiers of the British Empire had been hunted and driven back to the water's edge by a citizen army. They had returned, not as conquerors who had put down a rebellion, but as a besieged force, trapped in Boston by the very people they had set out to intimidate. The desperate escape was complete, but it was a victory that felt like a catastrophic defeat. As the sun finally set on the long and bloody day of April 19, 1775, the exhausted soldiers and militiamen could at last take stock of the day's terrible cost. The raw numbers of the butcher's bill told a story that was shocking to both sides, but especially to the British. The mission to Concord, intended as a swift and intimidating show of force, had devolved into a catastrophic military blunder. The British Empire, the most powerful global hegemon of its time, had suffered a stunning and humiliating blow at the hands of those it considered mere provincial farmers. The myth of British invincibility had been shattered in the course of a single day along a 16-mile stretch of country road. The British casualties were stark and undeniable. Out of the roughly 1,700 soldiers who participated in the day's actions, 73 were killed, 174 were wounded, and another 26 were missing, most of whom were presumed captured by the colonists. These were grievous losses for a professional army to suffer in what was supposed to have been a simple police action against a disorganized rabble. The retreat from Concord had cost them more casualties than many of the famous battles of the French and Indian War. The sight of the mauled, bloodied, and utterly exhausted survivors staggering into Charlestown sent a shock wave through the British command and the loyalist population of Boston. The American colonists had also paid a heavy price for their defiance, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting, especially in the close-quarters combat in Menotomy. Their losses amounted to 49 brave patriots killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. But while their casualties were significant, the strategic and political victory they had won was immeasurable. They had met the king's best troops in open combat, and not only stood their ground but had driven them back in a humiliating rout. They had successfully defended the majority of their military supplies and, more importantly, had proven to themselves and to the world that they had the will and the ability to fight for their liberty. For the British, the day was an unmitigated disaster on every level. The primary mission to seize the weapons it conquered was a clear failure. Worse still, their attempt to overawe and intimidate the rebellious colonists had backfired in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Instead of crushing the spirit of the rebellion, the actions of the British troops at Lexington and the subsequent running battle had fanned the embers of discontent into a raging inferno of revolutionary fury. The bloody road from Concord had become a powerful symbol of British tyranny and American resolve, a story that would spread like wildfire across the 13 colonies. The immediate aftermath of the battle was as significant as the fighting itself. The political fallout from the day's events was swift and decisive, forever altering the relationship between Great Britain and its American colonies. The blood spilled on the village green at Lexington and all along the battle road washed away any lingering hope for a peaceful reconciliation. What had begun as a war of words, a long and simmering debate over taxes, representation, and rights, had now become a war of blood. The first shots fired in anger had created a chasm between the two sides that could no longer be bridged by petitions or negotiations. The news of farmers and militiamen driving the elite troops of the British Army back to Boston was an electrifying call to arms that resonated throughout New England and beyond. The story of the Lexington Massacre and the heroic stand at Concord's North Bridge became a powerful piece of patriot propaganda. It galvanized thousands of colonists who may have previously been on the fence, convincing them that the time for debate was over and the time for armed resistance had arrived. The events of April 19th provided a clear, emotional, and undeniable justification for war, transforming a political movement into a full-fledged military revolution. In the days immediately following the battle, the strategic situation around Boston changed dramatically. In an incredible, spontaneous mobilization, the militia companies that had fought along the road did not simply go home. Instead, they stayed, and they were joined by thousands more. From all over Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, men picked up their muskets and marched towards Boston. Within a matter of days, a vast impromptu army of some 16,000 New Englanders had materialized, forming a great arc of encampments that stretched from Cambridge to Roxbury, effectively trapping General Gage and his entire army inside the city. The siege of Boston had begun. The British forces who had set out to disarm the countryside now found themselves besieged and cut off by that very same countryside. General Gage, who had commanded all of North America, was now the beleaguered commander of a garrison, his authority extending only as far as his cannons could reach. The hunter had truly become the hunted, penned in on the narrow peninsula of Boston. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord and the brutal running battle back to Boston were now undeniably the opening engagements of the long and arduous American Revolutionary War. The British mission to Concord was conceived as a show of overwhelming force, a quick and decisive police action designed to snuff out a rebellion before it could truly begin. It was intended to be a lesson in power, demonstrating the futility of resisting the authority of the crown. Instead, it became a disastrous 16-mile retreat that served as a powerful lesson of a very different kind. It proved to the world that a determined people, fighting on their own soil for a cause they believed in, could successfully stand against the disciplined might of a global empire. The day was a crucible that forged a new sense of American identity and purpose. The Redcoats returned to the sanctuary of Boston not as proud conquerors, but as a shaken and besieged army. They had witnessed firsthand the depth of colonial anger and the effectiveness of their unconventional tactics. The myth of the invincible British regular, an idea that had held the colonies in awe for a century, was shattered in the woods and along the stone walls of Massachusetts. The colonists, in turn, had discovered their own strength. They had faced the best soldiers the empire could send, and had not only survived, but had triumphed, instilling in them a newfound confidence that would sustain them through the difficult years of war that lay ahead. The road from Concord, stained with the blood of both British soldiers and American militiamen, was no longer just a simple path connecting two colonial towns. It had been transformed into a powerful national symbol. It was a testament, written in blood and sacrifice, to the idea that ordinary citizens had the right to defend their liberties against what they perceived as tyranny. The events of that single day embodied the spirit of the revolution, the courage of the Minutemen, the power of community mobilization, and the unshakable belief in the right to self-governance. It was the moment a protest became a war. Ultimately, the Bloody Road was the birthplace of the American Army and the cradle of the American Revolution. The determined farmers and tradesmen who picked up their guns on that fateful day set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the Declaration of Independence and the creation of a new nation. They demonstrated that the fight for freedom would not be easy or without cost, but that it was a cause worth fighting and dying for. The war had begun, not with a formal declaration or a grand battle, but with a series of desperate skirmishes on a country road that changed the course of history forever.